When I was a kid, it seemed that every adult around me wanted to offer me wisdom. And by that I mean they all seemed to have advice for me. You know, the right way to handle whatever situation was in my path. Many times this meant they were offering me tried and true sayings that they'd heard when they were kids. These things were presented as great truths, although even then I doubted some of them and noticed that others were a lot more like dire warnings than wisdom. As a child, some of them didn't even make sense, like a stitch in time saves 9, and I'd have to ask the adult to explain it to me. And to be fair, some would declare them to be superstitions or old wives' tales, but they still frequently found their way into conversations. So don't get me wrong, I don't automatically dismiss something because it's a superstition. I still throw spilled salt over my shoulder just in case. But I know the difference between a superstition and real truth. There's definitely wisdom in some of those old sayings, making them worthy for our consideration even in adulthood. And today I want to explore those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. That's attributed to George Santayana, and it has an ominous tone to it. I suppose it's meant to strike fear into the hearts of those who would blithely ignore the possible lessons of the past. And while I heard that one way back when, it has a corollary that I learned more recently. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. Santayana also said, almost every wise saying has an opposite one, no less wise to balance it. But I'm not sure if he was including his history comment in that. So take of it what you will. The obvious first question in response to this saying must be, does history repeat itself? Frankly, it's not a question that has a simple answer. I want to start with an immediate life example. For many years, I have heard that 50% of marriages end in divorce. Some researchers now claim that the current rate is more like 42 to 46%, which would imply we've made some progress. However, if one reads further, those same researchers point out that there are many couples who separate but never actually legally divorce. So if you add in those cases, the rate is still pretty much 50%. I've paid attention to this particular information since I became a seminarian and have been able to officiate at weddings. The reason I'm bringing it up today is because I think it's a good example of our topic. Those who do not know history are doomed to repeat it. There's another statistic that I think is sort of the proof of the pudding here, and that is the rate of divorce among second and third or subsequent marriages is daunting. 60% of second marriages end in divorce, and a whopping 73% of third marriages end in divorce. When I was teaching psychology and serving as a therapist, the general wisdom was that subsequent marriages after a divorce were either very good or very bad. And the variable that made many end up in each of those groups was whether those involved had taken time to learn what they did that contributed to the dissolution of the first marriage, or simply blindly went on to marrying the next person who came into their life. In other words, did they learn from their own history? And because we tend to run to type, in many cases, we make all the same mistakes both in whom we choose and how we behave in a subsequent marriage. The statistics would suggest that many of us don't do the requisite self-exploration and personal growth that would lead to a better result before we jump into the matrimonial pool for a subsequent time. To me, that sounds exactly like not learning from history. And of course, it isn't that simple. There are other factors that contribute to the likelihood of a given marriage succeeding or failing. But I do know that learning from experience is a major factor. And I learned one other thing in my personal experience. We can learn on the fly, as is the case in any relationship between or among humans. There are stressors, and the longer we are together, the more evident and more powerful those stressors will be. It is unlikely, maybe even impossible, that any two people will always want the same things. So eventually, there will be some level of trouble even in a good marriage. In my second marriage, and it lasted 27 years, and it ended in death, even though neither of us promised till death do us part. We finally had one of those unstoppable force meets an immovable object. And I found myself thinking, I shouldn't have to put up with this. I got divorced once and I know how to do it again. I actually kind of enjoyed my rebellious attitude for a little while. But then I realized that although that was right, what it would lead to is a case of serial monogamy. I could say, I shouldn't have to put up with anything I don't like. And I will go find myself someone who doesn't do, and now you can insert anything you have found with a significant other. But the truth I already knew was that while I could probably find someone who didn't do that, whatever it was, he would soon do something else I didn't like, and on and on. It was definitely true that my second husband didn't do any of the things that had doomed my first marriage. He came up with something entirely new. I decided the way I needed to look at the situation was to expect some implacable issues and decide if they mattered more than the good things we had together. And that's an important factor in why my second marriage lasted until death. Put two determined people together and there will be implacable issues. But they don't have to lead to the dissolution of the partnership. So that's my personal example of learning from history and not repeating the same mistakes. Generally speaking, I think there's another aphorism that fits here. The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over, but expecting a different result. I suppose that is the epitome of not learning from history. We actually know what we did, and it didn't work, but some part of our thinking says that was just a glitch. This time it will work. And if we are truly wedded to our process or previous responses, it may be hard to learn from past experience. That's the dilemma of our individual in the reading. She doesn't easily change her patterns of behavior. Karl Marx has a version of this lesson. First time we make a mistake, it looks like a tragedy. We didn't know enough to make a better choice. And that's not because we are stupid or not paying attention. It's simply a piece of life. But when the mistake comes back to bite us a second time, it's tragic. We didn't deserve that result, maybe. But we choose not to pay attention to what happened, to dissect cause and effect, own up to our own part in the whole mistake, and therefore we repeat it. And then it is farce. I'm not saying I never had that experience. That's, after all, why the autobiography in our reading is in 5 chapters instead of 2. Sometimes we really don't get it the first time around, so history does need to repeat itself if we are to learn. It's in the nature of things to repeat, and sometimes that leads to tragedy, but it also can lead to comedy if we don't pay attention, own our own part in things, and make more effective choices the next time around. But what I've been thinking about in recent times is history writ large, not personal history. And that can be very frustrating, even dispiriting. There are things going on in society that I can impact, but I can't control on my own. I think this is especially true in terms of social justice. The world, even limited to Orange County, is not something I can command to do my bidding. History, in that sense, will go on in spite of me. All I can do is attempt to stand with justice, work for those who are victimized, and speak out against oppression and unfairness. And particularly recently, I've been upset by the direction the society around me is taking. In the public arena, civility has all but disappeared as people snarl at one another, accuse each other of dastardly deeds or stupid ideas in language much harsher than that, and ridicule those who want to help the ones our society is treating badly. And you know, that's not just at the national broadcast level. I see it every day in the public square, whether it's being broadcast or not. So not only is it not the way I want to relate to others, but it violates our UU second principle, which calls us to relate to others with justice, equity, and compassion. This is particularly true in regard to racial and ethnic differences. And for me, it is very distressing. I lived through the struggle during the civil rights era in the 1950s and 60s. And it seemed to me that we made significant progress through the violent and bloody efforts of those who were oppressed and their allies. There were many who stood for the maxim that all persons are created equal. I wasn't so naive that I thought we'd eliminated racism, but I did think we were moving in the right direction. And then in the last 3 years or so, it seems that the dam has burst. Racism is alive and well in Orange County, as exemplified by the resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan and other hate groups, the rhetoric at city council, county board meetings, incidents at school, and other public occurrences. The hatred is palpable, and I find myself thinking we're right back where we were in the 1950s. And that is so depressing. What is the point of working to make things better if history is just going to repeat itself no matter what we do? I can live with unhappy consequences if I don't pay attention, or I keep on doing the same old thing because I'm being lazy or stubborn. But if nothing is going to change no matter what we do, then what's the point? If Martin Luther King and Medgar Evers and Malcolm X and Rosa Parks and all the other freedom fighters were simply tilting at windmills, that's way beyond tragic. That's nihilism, or theater of the absurd. And then what is the point of having faith in anything if nothing really changes, if nothing can be changed? But of course, that's only one part of the story. Some of us did learn from that past era. Some of us do know what comes next. and understand how important it is that we make certain it ends better this time around. Fortunately for me, and I guess for you, since you're sitting here listening to this, I came up with an antidote rather quickly. You see, I remember another saying, one that I didn't hear in my childhood, but in a quite quixotic way, was just the thing I needed. That aphorism is what formed the title of this sermon, but it rhymes. The quote, often attributed to Mark Twain, is that history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. And that is definitely a horse of a different color, perhaps even a zebra. Here's how HuffPost explains this. Clemens' generation witnessed an explosion of wealth unimaginable even one generation earlier as new industries rose up and productivity skyrocketed, as natural resources previously out of reach became easily accessible, and as technological advances allowed seemingly instantaneous communication around the globe. These developments also facilitated, even required, increased interactions between and interpretation of cultures, worldviews, and political systems. By Clemens' death in 1910, his globalized world was beginning to show signs of strain. Within a few years, a devastating war broke out in Europe and quickly spread via the same globalized structures to engulf the world. This was followed within a decade by the greatest economic meltdown ever recorded, generating a veritable tidal wave of populism throughout the Western world that toppled regimes, redrew the map, and ignited the greatest war ever recorded. History isn't repeating itself because new technology, new understandings, and new situations mean that what could be viewed as a repeat isn't the same. And we aren't the same. If nothing else, we now know that there are always unforeseen consequences, so we can be on the lookout for them, and perhaps even ward them off as soon as they begin to occur. Brian Adams, who wrote the article in HuffPost, says that that is a reason for hope. He concludes that what was begun at the beginning of the 20th century is being completed at the beginning of the 21st, but it hasn't yet rhymed. There's still time to turn mistrust into understanding. Still time to turn fear to respect. Still time to turn division into cohesion. In short, there's still time to change our tune. And that gave me reason not only to hope, but to take another look at today's version of racism. I'm sure you've already recognized, because I'm really an old English teacher, I love the idea of history rhyming rather than simply repeating. After all, a rhyme isn't exactly the same, but rather is an echo with some small difference. As I look at racism today, I see that it actually rhymes with the racism of the 50s and 60s. Don't get me wrong, it's still a horrific injustice based on assumptions that are falsely derived. Those of us who were present in the earlier time have learned from our experiences, and while there is still much to combat, we are stronger than those who were experiencing the evil of racism for the first time in their lives. A few years ago, I went on a 10-day civil rights tour, visiting Tennessee, Alabama, and Mississippi, not places I particularly wanted to go. We got to talk with people who lived through the bus boycott and the March from Selma to Montgomery. We visited historic churches and stood at the graves of those who died in the struggle. It was a profoundly moving experience, one where history was the story. Tears flowed profusely, and lessons were clearly illustrated. I doubt anyone could have come through such an experience unscathed, and I certainly didn't. Today's racism is still deeply hurtful to both the victim and the perpetrator, but the rhyme of it comes, at least in my mind, from the fact that we have seen both the heroes and the villains of the earlier time, and we can recognize the strength we possess to deal with awful things. Take good lessons from the thing we found that built a new society, at least one better than the time before. Recognize the devils that accompany this particular form of evil, because yes, I am saying that racism is evil, and not need to go back to the very beginning. That is, we can do all that if we are paying attention. The reason we must know history is because it allows us to see the warning signs, to build up to disaster or tragedy, and if we are very careful, to walk down a different street. I want to let Santiana give us our final thought for today. He said, history is always written wrong, and so it always needs to be rewritten. We do that by how we live our lives. We do it by what we pay attention to. If we have studied and understood, as well as possible, what happened in the past, we can use our imaginations and create better possibilities for resistance of the unwelcome, to resist the unwelcome consequences next time around. That is what I believe will allow us to move forward in our own lives and in the society in which we are